Hi, Misha here. Last time we talked about this plane, the Hawker Hurricane, along with the Typhoon variant. And to wrap things up with this little series, we finally get to the Spitfire. Here we have a Mark I, as used in the Battle of Britain and later the Blitz. And here we have a Mark XIV, as used late in World War II, 1944. So, relatively early version and a relatively late version. This is just mostly going to be a short overview because it's the Spitfire. I mean, good grief. I mean, 2-hour-long documentaries can be told about this thing. It was designed by Supermarine, who was owned by Vickers. There are a huge number of variations. There are 24. It went up to Mark 24 with 19 major variants and 52 sub-variants and more besides. It was the only British plane to be produced continuously all through World War II. It was produced from 1938 through 1948. It was the most produced British plane, with 20,350 built. It was in service with the RAF and Navy through the 1950s, and even served in Ireland until the early 60s. We basically have three major generations, classifications, families of Spitfire. You have the original few marks from about Mark I through about Mark VI or so. They're not continuous, sometimes they'll go in between, but these would have the single-stage Merlin engines. Then the next set will be through the early teens, and they'll have the two-stage Merlins. And then finally we have the most powerful, largest, heaviest ones. These are powered by the Griffon engine. First it was a single stage itself, and then later they would go to a two. This would be the first two-stage here. Well, the Spitfire dates all the way back to 1931, when the RAF wanted a new modern interceptor. Of course, they would go with the Hawker Fury. Supermarine got to work in 1934. They had their Model 224, which was an open cockpit, relatively modern plane, and it went up against the Gloucester Gladiator, and of course the Gladiator won. Hawker would rework it into the Model 300. The Air Ministry wasn't interested. Finally, they would work it into the Model 310, which would have a folding undercarriage, an enclosed canopy. It would use the Merlin engine like the then very new Hurricane. And I think the Air Ministry just got kind of tired of them pestering them, so they finally ordered a prototype. 1935, they would work on the Spitfire, as it would be known. And it would first fly in March of 1936, which was only a few months after the Hurricane first flew. But whereas the Hurricane was a pretty traditional plane, I mean, it was, a monoplane with a closed cockpit and had modern features, the Spitfire used a lot of new construction, more metal, new styles of riveting and sheet metal, and it was a very modern plane. The Air Ministry, the RAF, would order initially 300, and they were supposed to go into production right away in 1936, but the whole modern construction thing and getting the assembly lines set up and everything delayed production until 1938. by which time 500 were on order. Again, the political situation in Europe was deteriorating, and we would soon get to the Munich crisis and so on and so forth. Initially, the prototype would be designed for 2 machine guns. Later, this would be upped to 4 303s, and then 8 as enough machine guns became available. So the early Spitfires would usually have 8 303 caliber machine guns. This was designed to be a high-performance interceptor, not really long-ranged or anything, but it was designed to fly up fast to high altitudes and intercept bombers or other fighters. The initial prototypes were about 340 miles per hour. They did some tweaking. They got that up to 350, then eventually 370. But with successive versions and more powerful engines, they would bump the maximum speed up to near 450. So as the war went on, they would become more and more speedy. That said, as I said in the Hurricane video, the Hurricane was slower, but it had better turning. The Spitfire was faster, had really good climb, but its turning was a little sacrificed. And of course, the Mark I, Mark IIs were relatively lightweight planes. They were just under 30 feet long, with just under a 37-foot wingspan. But as they went to later Marks, they would add weight. The Griffon engine here was a much heavier engine, had more fuel, more oil. As you notice, it has a 5-bladed propeller. This was introduced as a standard feature with the Mark XIV here. So they got speed, but they lost a little bit when it came to maneuverability, and just again, it was just a heavier plane. Anywho, these were in frontline service, 1939, 1940. They were in production, and they were used extensively, as you all know, for the Battle of Britain, where they were primarily tasked with intercepting fighters, allowing the Hurricanes to go for the German bombers. While they did not have quite the high kill ratio of the Hurricanes, they had a better survival rate. They shot down more than they lost compared to the Hurricane. The ratio was better, so they had that going for them. They were a little slower to produce, more expensive than the Hurricane, but you know, it was a Spitfire, and of course it became very iconic in Britain. They would have all kinds of wing configurations and gun configurations. They would start working with 20mm cannons, as seen on this one here, as early as 1940. They would have what they would call A, B, C, D, E wings, different styles. They would have some that would have 4 303 machine guns, 8 303 machine guns, 2 20mm cannons, 4 20mm cannons, a mix of this and that, interchangeable. They even have some versions that would have 2 50 caliber machine guns. This was always pretty much a dedicated fighter interceptor, although there were photo reconnaissance versions. But unlike with the Hurricane and other fighters, this was never really used as a fighter bomber per se. It was a dedicated, what we would think of today as an air superiority. Of course, this would see combat all the way through World War II. These would be used in the Pacific against the Japanese, but in much smaller numbers than they were used in Europe. They were faster than the A6M0, but again, the A6M0, much like the Hurricane, could outturn the Spitfire, so they had to develop tactics to go with that. They would also start sending Spitfires to Russia in 1943, and they would get several thousand, they would get about 1,200, 1,300, so not near as many as the Hurricane, but quite a few. Again, their reputation in Russia wasn't the best. Part of it was some of the early Spitfires Russia got were refurbished, older models, older marks. When they started actually getting new production and updated marks, the reputation became better. But to be fair, Russia just kind of complained about Lend-Lease gear no matter what. Actually, originally the Griffon engine was developed for the Royal Navy, who needed a better performing engine at low altitudes and for carrier operations. They would first test a Griffon-powered Spitfire out in 1941, and then this version here, the first prototype of the Mark XIV, flew in January of 1943 and was to go into squadron service in December of that year. It wasn't the first version to have a Griffon, but it was kind of the first successful Griffon, you might say, although the Spitfire Mark V was the most produced variant of them all, and that was more like this Mark I over here. It still had a Merlin. The specialized naval version was known as the Seafire. Originally, the Seafire was basically the same plane, but as time went on, it would devolve and change and split from the Spitfire more and more. Not only would they keep these in production after World War II, they produced them in 1948, the final Marks would not even be released until after World War II, so they were still tinkering with the design well into what was the dawn of the jet age. Lots of little changes happened between Marks of the Spitfire. For example, this has what's called the teardrop canopy. If you notice, the antenna's gone. I didn't break it off. It didn't have it. They had it early on. But as updates and changes happened to the radio system, they went to kind of a more of an aerial whip in the back. So lots of little changes can be observed in different Marks of Spitfire. And there you really have it, folks. As I said, a lot could be said about this, and if you're interested, a lot can be read about this as well. Obviously, these are from Corgi, 172 diecast. No surprises in the models. I mean, mostly metal, typical detailing. And of course, they do bajillions of different marks and variations of the Spitfire, so you can more or less pick your favorite, your ideal variant. But I couldn't do a video on British planes and not talk about the Spitfire. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any questions or just want to talk about Spitfires in the comments, please post below. This is Misha, and I'll be back soon with some other ramblings. I'll catch you then.